Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to what I'm sure is your 100th Zoom event over the last few months. My name is Rachel Rizzo. I'm the Director of Programs here at the Truman National Security Project. Thanks to all of you for joining today for this conversation on the future of bilateral talks with North Korea, especially in the time of COVID-19. We're honored to be joined by our three panelists today, and we're excited to get started. I'd like to just start with a few logistical items. We are going to be hosting a question and answer session for the last 30 to 25 minutes of this event. So for the attendees, if you take a look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see the Q&A function. During the event, while our panelists are talking, please feel free to start posing questions, and they'll be addressed during the Q&A session during the last half of the event. So with that, I will say thank you again for joining us, and I'll pass it over to our moderator, Devin T. Stewart, who's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. Devin, over to you.
Thanks so much, everyone, and it's a real pleasure to be working with Truman again, and it's a really special community, especially for this extremely timely event today, given the recent new speculation still about a possible Kim-Trump summit even this year. That's something we might want to talk about during this event today. Of course, the South Korean government has been pushing for such diplomacy as well. They've always been rooting for more diplomacy. And it's also important to understand how the COVID crisis is shaping North Korea's actions, such as the decision to destroy the Joint Diplomatic Liaison Office. It's important to get the real context of what North Korea is thinking, what are the various factors that is shaping its actions, because a lot of its actions are not always intuitive or straightforward. And for that, we have an incredible panel of two very capable, experienced experts. It's a real pleasure to be serving as their moderator. They are Elizabeth Beavers, who is Advocacy Advisor working with Women Cross DMZ, which is a women-led campaign to end the Korean War. Elizabeth is an attorney, analyst, and advocate for peace and security. And Jean Lee is Director of the Korea Program at the Wilson Center. She is a Pulitzer-nominated veteran, foreign correspondent, and expert on North Korea. She led the AP News Agency's coverage of the Korean Peninsula as bureau chief from 2008 to 2013. And those are very interesting, colorful backgrounds that we should get straight into. And that's how I'd like to just begin by asking the two of you to just briefly give us a sense of your connection with North Korea, or your organization's connection with North Korea, because it's so interesting. And just going to start with just alphabetical order, start with Elizabeth and go to Jean. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Devin. And thank you, Truman, for having us. This is really great. Can folks hear me okay? Everything good? Yes, great. So I'm working with Women Cross DMZ. As Devin mentioned, it is a women-led global campaign working with the Korea Peace Now campaign, just simply calling for a formal end to the Korean War, which I think most Americans don't even realize never actually ended. We're in the 70th year of the unresolved war now. And so what Women Cross DMZ tries to do is make the connections between that unresolved war. What could our US-Korea policy look like if we embraced a policy of peace, if we really meaningfully put it on the table as a foundation for other goals and other negotiations? So Women Cross DMZ in 2015 organized a historic peace march across the demilitarized zone, including women peace builders from North Korea, from South Korea, from the US, and from all over the world. It was a really amazing event. It was pretty one of its kind. I'm thrilled to be working with them. They've taught me a lot. And so what we really focus on now is, from that peace march, from that momentum, how do we address here in the US our policy, and how do we look at it from a different perspective of putting peace first? And so that's what I do with them. I work through what our opportunities are with the US Congress, especially looking at how this plays politically and as a policy matter in the US. So very glad to be here.
Jean?
As you mentioned, my background is as a journalist, and people often ask me when I made the decision to cover North Korea. But frankly, I didn't make that decision. It was an assignment that was given to me, but I knew my entire career that I wanted, after starting my career in South Korea at the Korea Herald, I knew that I wanted to get back to Korea with an international news agency and write the stories that people weren't writing. And of course, a big one is North Korea. That's the first thing any foreign correspondent tries to figure out, is how do you get into North Korea? For me personally, I started on the day that Kim Jong-il disappeared, and this was in September 2008. This was the day that the world and the North Koreans learned that he had suffered a stroke and was in a coma. It was my first day of work. And also on that day, I was told that I would have to try to help the AP open an office in North Korea. And so that's what I did. So in between trying to cover this mystery of what happened to Kim Jong-il and what would happen with the transition to leadership and making trips to North Korea starting in 2008, I was also negotiating the opening of an AP office. And I did get permission from the North Koreans to join the local Foreign Press Corps in 2011, the first American journalist allowed to join the Foreign Press Corps, and of course opened the AP Pyongyang Bureau in January 2012, just as Kim Jong-un was coming to power. And so I've traveled to North Korea since 2008. I spent 3 years on the ground there, 2011, 2012, and 2013. And I try to bring to all of our discussions about North Korea my understanding of who they are, how they think, what they want, based on essentially living and working with the North Koreans for those 3 years.
Fantastic. We should get right to that. Maybe a sort of a two-part question for the both of you is, what is your assessment of the current situation in North Korea given the COVID crisis? How is COVID shaping North Korea's behavior, its sense of its interests and its actions? And related to that, how do you see what Pyongyang wants from the international community, for the Korean Peninsula, for its relationships with Washington and other capitals? What is the sort of, as Jean said, what is the thinking in Pyongyang? Let's start with Elizabeth.
Yeah, sure. So we have very little concrete information about exactly what the impact of the pandemic has looked like within North Korea. Of course, they reported no cases, but it's a testament to the extreme isolation of North Korea. It's just so difficult to have really on the ground concrete information. We do know, of course, that there have been hundreds of thousands of cases near them. We also know that they remain rather vulnerable. And I think from Women Cross DMZ's perspective, a really key thing to keep in mind is that the US in some ways is contributing to that vulnerability through its sanctions regime. Experts such as Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, Tomas Quintana, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the DPRK, have talked about the sanctions regime that continues to be on top of North Korea and how that has impacted things like medical care, things like food insecurity. So that's something for us to really grapple with. It's a key moment to be thinking about how are we perhaps actively putting regular North Koreans under further strain and causing further suffering during this pandemic. It's also a moment for us to rethink, what does security mean? What is it that makes us safe? Our limited knowledge about the situation in North Korea and our restricted ability to contribute to each other's health and stability, it certainly hasn't made us safer, hasn't made them safer. Diplomatic isolation and military pressure really have been a poor combination. The threat that we all face now in this global pandemic calls for a new approach. So that's pretty much our perspective on the impact of COVID. With regard to what Pyongyang wants, again, because of the extreme isolation, because we don't have diplomatic relations, it's so hard to know 100%. So much of it is reading tea leaves, looking at statements, getting as much information from the ground as we can, and doing some speculation from there. But I would flag, there was this statement recently from Kim Yo-jong, Kim Jong-un's sister, got a lot of attention. There's some pieces she really drew out about how the negotiations in Hanoi that ended up falling apart, that second big summit, how that was a one-off opportunity, that they don't have any more interest in sanctions relief, that they don't want to see an additional summit unless the US changes its hostile policy. Those things are actually really not new. Those have been consistent statements that we've heard out of Pyongyang for quite a while. Every single one of those pieces has been addressed and reiterated before. So, you know, what we're hearing, at least from North Korea's statements, and I do think it's important to, as much as we can, glean what do they want, why do they do what they do, and what is the best way we can adjust our policy to get results and to actually move the needle forward. They're telling us, it sounds like, that they are interested in not being in a hostile relationship with Washington, that they're interested in peace, that they're interested in security assurances, and that they don't see the value of high-level summitry unless the administration here in the US is actually coming to the table with a different proposal. So that's what we're seeing so far.
And Jean, what do they want? What are the
those are some big questions. I'm just going to take a step back, and regarding the sanctions, because Elizabeth mentioned it, there's no doubt that the UN sanctions that have been imposed on North Korea, particularly the ones imposed since 2016 to punish North Korea for its nuclear and missile activity, which are violations of UN Security Council resolutions. And those sanctions are designed to really restrict their ability to build that program. There's no doubt that those have caused incredible hardship on the North Korean economy. And in addition to that, the border restrictions that North Korea has imposed since January have made it very difficult. But I just want to point out that these border restrictions were imposed by North Korea, and numerous organizations have applied for and received exemptions from the UN Security Council to send supplies and aid into North Korea. But it is because of North Korea's own restrictions that these groups have not been able to send the aid in. So I think we need to differentiate. Of course, the sanctions have been tough on the North Koreans, but we need to recognize that due to COVID-19, North Korea has imposed restrictions that has made it virtually, I shouldn't say virtually impossible, very difficult for aid groups to get aid in. Now, we are seeing reports from the Red Cross, the International Federation for the Red Cross, that they finally, after 4 months of delays imposed by the North Koreans, after getting that sanctions exemptions from the United Nations, that they were finally able to get supplies. So about 10,000 masks. About 10,000 test kits, about several thousand masks. Gowns are still being held up in Beijing, but they were able to get those into North Korea. Now, I think the WHO has also advised that they have gotten they've gotten tests into North Korea, and the North Koreans have tested about 900 people, and they claim that they're all negative. Now, the second problem is that because of North Korea's border restrictions and quarantine requirements, foreign groups cannot monitor the distribution of these supplies. And that has made it very difficult for foreign aid groups to allow the aid to go in, because it's a matter of accountability. They absolutely need to be able to monitor the distribution and allocation of the supplies and aid. And that's to ensure accountability, not only now, but down the road. And so a number of aid groups are saying, we can't actually send this in if the North Koreans aren't going to allow us in. So it's a really complicated issue. And so I would say that we have to recognize there are the sanctions that are imposed from the outside, and there are also the rules that are imposed by North Korea, and North Korea has to be ready, willing, and able to accept outside help in order for that aid to be distributed. I think, in terms of what it is North Korea wants, I mean, there's no question that North Korea is aware that its people are both fragile, and I should say people are fragile and its medical system is fragile. I spent a lot of time in hospitals, and I can tell you firsthand how difficult it would be for hospitals and clinics across North Korea to cope with any type of spread of this pandemic. And so they recognize, like many Asian countries, the severity and the risk of this virus. But I think there's more to it than that. I do think that Kim Jong-un has used this as an opportunity to really shut himself and his country off. And so we're seeing that he's using the pandemic, and there's, it's a lot of countries do this type of thing. He's using it to rally the people together and to create the impression that there's this outside threat, in this case, a global pandemic, that requires him to shut the borders and sequester the country, and for them to focus on fighting this as one people. It's a very interesting strategy. But what it means is that, as Elizabeth mentioned, we don't have people on the ground. We don't have a good view into what's happening. They say that they have 0 confirmed cases. It's very hard to believe when they border China. We know that this virus probably existed long before it was reported in January, and there was a lot of cross-border traffic until then. Very hard to believe, but it will also be very hard for us to get an accurate answer. And I do think that Kim Jong-un has staked his some legitimacy on his ability to keep this virus out. So it may be that we may not get any solid answers on whether coronavirus has really struck any parts of the population.
Elizabeth mentioned the need for a new approach. It always seems like there's a need for a new approach with North Korea. It seems to be kind of the conventional wisdom. And, there was some optimism about Trump being unorthodox about his approach of just sort of going to the top and, maybe establishing personal rapport with Kim. What is your assessment of the U.S. approach that's been tried so far with North Korea? And what are the prospects for diplomacy that you see in the coming months before, before the election, our election, and also the role of South Korea? I mean, South Korea has always been cheerleading for more diplomacy. And I also, the context of Kim Yo-jong's, Kim's sister, Kim Yo-jong, rising star, gaining influence. She said that there's probably not going to be a U.S.-North Korea summit, but surprises can happen. So it sounded like she might be leaving the door open to something. Those are a few questions. Elizabeth?
Yeah, just small questions. Very easy to answer.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's true. All of these questions we're talking about, they're big, they're complicated, as Jean mentioned. And even some of that, to respond a bit to what Jean's mentioning with regard to North Korea's continued defensiveness and self-established isolation that happens. Once again, and this is not a surprise coming from my organization, we do have to remember through all of this, there is still very much a wartime mentality that feels like a technicality here in the US, but is very much real. And so, one thing I do want to make sure is when we talk about what we've tried so far, I do want to make sure we're not framing the current impasse in a way that suggests the U.S. has been a purely benevolent actor that has simply tried multiple tactics and failed when it comes to North Korea. I think, it's impossible to figure out the right way forward without grappling with our own historical context and culpability. It's worth remembering that North Korea as a state exists. They originated because of arbitrary division along the peninsula by U.S. officials. They emerged as a regime after a U.S.-led indiscriminate bombing campaign that destroyed 80% of its cities. And even in past negotiations, the U.S. has reneged on certain commitments from the agreed framework and the six-party talks. There were aspects of commitments that the U.S. made that they didn't quite come through on. So it's important context to remember that the diplomacy very much is a two-way street, and we, in thinking about what we want North Korea to do, we also have to think about what can we do that is the most productive, and what behaviors that we do can we control. So to try to answer that question, our diagnosis of what has been tried and what has failed in the Trump administration, to a certain extent in the Obama administration as well, is the thinking that more sanctions, more military tensions, more isolation will pressure North Korea into certain behaviors. We hear that slogan now, right? Maximum pressure. for this administration when it comes to Iran, when it comes to North Korea. That's the mantra. And even though Trump has, wavered between, we had in 2017 like nuclear threats of fire and fury, and then recently we have like love letters and they're best friends or whatever, the basic policy has actually remained the same, an expectation that North Korea make big unilateral disarmament concessions in advance of any real sanctions relief or security assurances. So what we would like to see, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a bit later, is more of a step-by-step approach, more of having small, reciprocal, verifiable interim deals, not trying to go for a grand bargain that's all or nothing. The Obama administration didn't have maximum pressure, but they had strategic patience, which is kind of the same thinking that if we just sort of wait North Korea out, if we continue to apply pressure, that their behavior will change based on being tough and cracking down. And instead of providing those incentives and rewards and back and forth, step-by-step reciprocal. In the same way, we saw that the Obama administration had a real victory on the JCPOA when they negotiated a nuclear deal with Iran, and what has really ripped that apart has been returning to maximum pressure. It would be useful to look at that same approach to say, what can we sit down and what can we step-by-step agree to, where we make small concessions, you make small concessions, and we work from there, and we verify each other along the way. And of course, having peace as a foundation, not as a bargaining chip in those talks.
And you sent me a message about elaborating on is it the last question, Elizabeth? Did you want to?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Hopefully not too off topic now, but I was just going to add to exactly what Jean says about the complication of the sanctions regime. Another complication that has contributed during COVID is what we have heard from some close coalition partners who do have a humanitarian presence on the ground. Some have agricultural assistance and that sort of thing. It has been sort of unprecedentedly difficult to get into North Korea and get the waivers that they need for the humanitarian access at this time. They are given runarounds. A close partner of ours was like investigated by OFAC for basically no reason after having decades of a really successful and accountable and productive humanitarian agricultural assistance program on the ground in North Korea. And so even within the US, despite talk from this administration about being warm and reaching out on the leader to leader level, when it actually plays out on the ground with operating waivers, which are clearly within existing law, it's what humanitarian groups have been getting for a while, as Jean mentioned, in addition to those barriers that North Korea is putting up, the US has been interfering in a lot of ways in allowing that humanitarian presence to be on the ground. And I did just want to I sort of already mentioned this, but make the connection that it's still evidence of that wartime mentality that we continue to see.
So I would just, again, taking a step back, these sanctions are in essence part of diplomacy, as strange as that may seem. They serve as a diplomatic tool for the United States for those negotiations with the North Koreans, just as the North Koreans are building up its arsenal so that they have something to negotiate with. I think the Americans are also using those sanctions as a tool for negotiations. And so I think from the US perspective, if you were to erode the effectiveness of those sanctions and erode the effectiveness of that as a tool, then you have less to negotiate with when they get back to that nuclear negotiation table, which I think will happen eventually. It always does. And so it's a really hard question, because in the meantime, tens of thousands of people are suffering. But this is, unfortunately, they're collateral damage. Part of it is, it's both of these governments making these decisions, and the people have no say in it whatsoever. However, if you look at the long game, and you're weighing, well, if this is going to bring us to the negotiation table, and it's going to bring about a better end for both the American people and the North Korean people, perhaps it's worth it. So it's a real philosophical question, and I think it's debatable. But I just wanted to mention that point, that you could also see the sanctions as a diplomatic tool, and the U.S. insistence on maintaining maximum pressures to avoid breaking down the effectiveness of the sanctions. I think as long as, the longer we go, the less effective they are. We are actively seeing North Korea trying to work around them, perhaps working with China illicitly with what we're seeing from the panel of experts from the United Nations who look at these and examine reports about sanctions violations, that increasingly there are ship-to-ship transfers offshore to allow the North Koreans to sneak in what they need. So it's, once that is happening on a larger scale, especially because China certainly doesn't want North Korea to collapse economically, it takes away from the effectiveness of the sanctions. And it could perhaps be seen as that waivers could do that as well. I think I wanted to get back to your question about diplomacy. I think President Trump underestimated how difficult it would be to convince Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear weapons. He has a basic lack of understanding about how important those nuclear weapons are to Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un has staked so much in them. And so he's not going to be bullied into giving them up that easily. And that's a basic fact that we need to understand about North Korean thinking. And so there's a lot at stake. And so I'm not surprised. I think that now that President Trump, perhaps in Hanoi, he realized it wasn't going to be that easy. It wasn't going to be an easy foreign policy victory. And so he put that on hold. Kim Jong-un recognizes that he has an opportunity with President Trump. And so he's willing to allow President Trump to put North Korea on hold for the time being while he focuses on his re-election campaign. But in the meantime, he's going to be working on building his program so that when he gets to that negotiation table again, he's going to be in a stronger position. And so that's the risk that we face, and that's inevitable. We certainly saw a number of missile tests earlier this spring that helped refine some of the technical aspects of the program, but they were not large enough to confront President Trump. Now, I think the real question is North Korea, they're watching and waiting because they don't know yet if President Trump is going to be the person they're facing next year. And so they're watching and waiting to see what happens with the elections. And so, I think a lot of the media reports about Kim Yo-jong, his sister's comments, have been off base. I don't think that they've seen that if you really look closely at her statements, she's actually saying, we're not closing the door to negotiations, but we need to have more reassurance that we'll get more than we did in Hanoi. At any time that we sit down to the table. So if you're a nuclear negotiator on the U.S. side, you better be looking closely and reading between the lines to see what it is they're saying and not reading everything at face value.
You should tell
did you want to talk about?
You should tell your old colleagues at the AP at that point that you just made, because the headline is always no chance of talks, but then the third paragraph is there's a chance for talks.
So I think, absolutely. I think that, this is the challenge, and I'll say as a journalist, obviously I've been covering this issue for many, many years, but I cannot tell you, I still remember landing in Seoul and just being completely confused by KCNA, the state news agency, because every report was so dramatic. And learning how to read KCNA intelligently took years. And I still think that, it's every reporter who covers North Korea should go through intensive North Korean media studies, but they don't. We don't have North Korean media studies, or we don't have North Korean studies. They don't speak Korean oftentimes, and they don't know that, South Koreans have very little education about North Korea, to be honest. And so we rely on South Koreans to help us decipher this, but often the young South Korean reporters are just as confused about what they're reading as we are. And so one of the challenges we face right now when we're so shut out is we don't have people on the ground, journalists. We have a lot of diplomats have had to leave because of the restrictions imposed upon them. And so we don't have eyes and ears on the ground as much as we would like. And we also don't have journalists who understand what it is we're reading. I just hope that our diplomats and our State Department know enough to read between the lines, and I think they do. Did you want to get to the inter-Korean issue, or?
Sure. Well, we are starting to get questions from the audience, and just to remind the audience to submit them, to continue to submit them, and maybe I'll just have one last question to throw out where you can talk about inter-Korean relations in the context of this sort of broad question looking into the future. What should we expect from a Biden administration or a Trump administration next year? And what would you recommend to foster peace on the Korean Peninsula? Are there useful models out there, such as China, Vietnam, Libya, or Iran, where models for peace have worked elsewhere and might be considered for the Korean Peninsula? So again, that's a lot of stuff in one question. So maybe you could use that to just have some concluding remarks about what to expect, and then we can take some of the audience questions. Elizabeth?
Sure. Yeah. Once again, easy questions. This issue is really weird politically in our domestic politics, right? We've seen some Democrats critique Trump from a hawkish place, suggesting that the summits are what he's done wrong. What we would say he's done wrong is failing to oversee committed, sustained, step-by-step diplomacy and sticking with maximalist demands. You mentioned what's a model that works. A model that definitely doesn't work is the Libya model of proposing basically unilateral disarmament in advance of any other concessions. So it would be great to hear Biden or Trump. I should say it's not only it's not super clear what the sort of Democratic Party line position is, like what the positive vision is of a progressive leaning North Korea policy. It's also really hard to tell what to expect from Trump, right? I mean, it has been really all over the place. I would hope that Biden has moved past the Obama era strategic patience. What we would recommend is our vision of what a real pro-peace, pro-diplomacy policy would look like when it comes to North Korea and a new administration, whomever that might be. Again, we want to step back from the all or nothing demands. It's exactly, as Jean was saying, Devin, you mentioned the headlines and the coverage is always like summit or no summit. At the debates, the only North Korea questions we got in the presidential primaries was, will you talk to Kim Jong-un or won't you? And it's really not as much about that. It's really more about what actual proposals are being brought to the table. And that's what I read Kim Yo-jong's statement as saying as well. And Jean mentioned like that, leaving that door. They're looking for, what's the point of talking again? What are you bringing that's different? What are we talking about that's different? So we would suggest a step-by-step, reciprocal, verifiable interim deals. Go step by step rather than all or nothing. Build confidence, reduce tensions, build diplomatic relations. There are ways we can do that. We can refrain from actions that constrict or complicate diplomacy, some of the aggressive military exercises, certain sanctions that we've talked about. We can continue repatriation of remains. That was going well for a while. Facilitating reunions between divided families who are still kept apart by the war. Ending the Korean War is another thing we can do to build confidence, reduce tensions. And again, with the inter-Korean piece, supporting South Korean leadership. As you mentioned, South Korean President Moon has really just been a leader and pushing for more diplomatic engagement, pushing for more talks. The U.S. has in many ways impeded some of the inter-Korean cooperation and sort of chastised South Korea for getting out ahead of the U.S.'s nuclear talks. It would be great to just let South Korea and North Korea cooperate on whether it's economic projects, whatever it is, not stand in the way of that. And making the negotiating table more inclusive for women cross DMZ. It's a huge thing for us. We know that when women are involved, youth, civil society are at the negotiating table, peace is more durable, more sustainable, we get more productive results. The last thing I would just say overall in what we would hope to see, what we would recommend is rejecting the framing that diplomacy and peace is some sort of gift to North Korea or it's being soft. What we think is that it's actually something that we haven't tried. It costs $0. It's a really concrete way that we can start to signal a change in the course. It's not, the ultimate solution to everything, but it can signal that we are taking that new approach and that we're looking to normalize relations. We're stepping back from the wartime mentality. We're coming to the negotiating table in good faith. And it's unfortunate when we hear leaders talk about diplomacy or peace as like a concession in and of itself. Those are the tools. Those are the tools that we know in many other contexts have worked. We don't have a lot of historic evidence that just more and more and more pressure without a negotiated exit ramp into positive results actually gets us anywhere. So that's what we're hoping to see from the next administration, whomever it may be.
Jean?
So it's a difficult question. I would say that things are so complicated when it comes to the use of the word peace. And that's, so for example, I think that there's been some discussion about perhaps a peace agreement to start the process toward a peace treaty. It's not something, a peace treaty, converting the armistice agreement that was signed 67 years ago in 1953, that was only meant to last 6 months or so, but converting that into a peace treaty is going to be very complicated. And I think there are consequences, because it's a question of whether we trust the North Koreans to abide by any agreements that are made as part of a peace process. And I think there's a lot of a lack of trust, and for good reason, because it is true that the North Koreans have violated international agreements on a regular basis. And so the South Koreans need to be wary and protective of their population and their people because of the past history and the lack of respect that the North Koreans have had to some of these international agreements. And so I think that you've got a mixed reaction in South Korea to any kind of a peace agreement with North Korea. I wouldn't say that the South Koreans are 100% in favor of it. You've got a very divided population on how to think about North Korea and whether they can coexist peacefully with them. So I think it's a complicated issue. In regard to the inter-Korean, the fact is South Korea was not a signatory to the armistice. That was signed by the North Koreans and the Chinese on one side and the US and the UN on the other side. And so with that history in mind, the North Koreans are targeting their diplomacy to focus on the US. And so, they see South Korea as a vehicle or as somebody a country that they can use to their advantage only in relation to their relationship with the United States. And so it's very hard when we talk about inter-Korean, and of course the South Koreans should have a say in what happens in their country. But in some sense, the North Koreans are looking at the United States for this, to settle this issue, not the South Koreans. Now, but they will use the South Koreans when they can, which they did effectively in 2018 with the Pyeongchang Olympics. And I think they just did it this spring. They manufactured this tension at the border. Manufactured this tension over propaganda leaflets, blew up their joint liaison office in Kaesong, which is on the North Korean side of the border. It was a very symbolic gesture on the part of the North Koreans that sent a message to the South Koreans that, you're not doing enough. We blame you for the way things are. Remember, as I said earlier, Kim Jong-un doesn't want to confront President Trump directly. So in a sense, he's using the South Koreans to try to force change. And what he did by really causing this tension between the two Koreas is compel President Moon to completely shuffle his administration. So in the past week, we've seen a new unification minister, a new national security advisor. So we've seen the key figures who are dealing with inter-Korean relations in South Korea change hands. And they are all people who are more actively going to push for direct inter-Korean engagement, and perhaps less inclined to coordinate with the United States. And so that poses an issue and a challenge for Washington. And for that, we saw the special representative, the Deputy Secretary of State, Steve Biegun, go to Seoul to touch base with the South Koreans. So this is going to be a challenge for the United States and South Korea, is to make sure that they're on the same page. And so I'm not taking a stance here, I'm just laying out what I see as happening and how the North Koreans have used inter-Korean relations to try to force a situation or to force a change in policy. And so this is how I see it, purely my point of view. But this is what I see as the consequence and the ramification of the inter-Korean tensions prompted by that explosion of the Joint Liaison Office just across the border.
We're starting to get some very good questions here. They're all great and provocative and interesting. So just take them in order. The first one is, I'm going to paraphrase here. Why don't we just, let the North Koreans be, a nuclear power? That way we can make some progress. And I'm not mocking this question. I actually am quite sympathetic to it because, they are a nuclear power. So, saying what reality is doesn't seem so controversial if it could lead to peace. But I'd be more curious to hear about what the panel thinks. Elizabeth?
Yeah, so it's a super interesting question because we should deal with reality as it is and not as we want it to be. And just more broadly, it is the case that the nuclear weapons question is applied quite unevenly. We have supposed to have a system where there's a class of countries who are nuclear powers and those who are not, and we're all working towards disarmament. But there's been tolerance for possession of nuclear weapons outside of that paradigm. And I think from Women Cross DMZ's perspective, we would probably not endorse an approach that was like, come on in, more people have nuclear weapons, that's great. I think what we do want to see though is moving toward a world in where we are all working towards disarmament, we're working towards less. And that's why we're so interested in this question. It's not that we don't care about the denuclearization question. We want everyone to denuclearize. We want to free the world from the threat of nuclear war that, as we know, can be so devastating and can just incalculable the amount of damage that's on the table when nuclear weapons are a legitimate tactic that is in the hands of unstable regimes, including our own right now, from our perspective. And so, I think, again, it brings us back to, so how do we actually get there? How do we actually move forward? While we have had stalled talks, while we have had reneged deals, while we have had continued unresolved war over the years, if maybe we had come from a different approach a really long time ago, North Korea built their weapons in the meantime. So now what is more likely to actually step away from that? And I would certainly suggest that being in a continued state of war and having a certain defensiveness is probably not the ticket to getting to denuclearization. It's obviously very difficult to imagine full denuclearization, but again, that step-by-step approach, can we start reducing that capability? Can we start getting at some of those sites? Can we start getting at some of that testing? And actually, Jean mentioned the trust component, which obviously is so complicated between our two countries who have so long been in a state of war, but how can we verify one another? How can we actually know whether commitments are being made or not? And really, diplomacy is all we have to get there. It just is. It's all we have. So that's why we think it's worthwhile, is because any country with nuclear weapons is dangerous. We want to get to a world without them.
I just want to remind everyone that this diplomacy did not start with President Trump in 2018. It's been going on for a quarter century. And so we also need to do our homework, and that's something I would mention to the a possible Biden administration is, let's go back and look at the diplomacy that's been done in the past, the agreements that have been made in the past. We had a 6-party talks process that got stuck at the verification issue because the North Koreans saw the invasiveness of verification as a threat to their sovereignty, and so got stuck and fell apart on the verification issue. So go back over those agreements. Make sure you don't make the same mistakes. Understand where it is the North Koreans are sensitive and find a way to work around it while holding the North Koreans accountable to anything they agree to. I think, I'm sorry, I completely lost. The question was about, the nuclear issue. The fact is, the fire and fury of 2017 allowed Kim Jong-un to get to a point where he could build a nuclear program that is a verifiable threat. But it terrifies me if we acknowledge and accept North Korea into the nuclear club, because although that might be the practical way forward, I think about the region. South Korea will forever be under threat. North Korea will forever threaten South Korea with nuclear weapons if they don't feel that they're getting what they need from South Korea. And so for me, my family living in South Korea, I do not want to imagine a future where they're constantly living under that threat. And on top of that, I do think that we're starting to see calls in South Korea because of the strength of North Korea's nuclear programs for their own nuclear weapons. And if they decide to build nuclear weapons, Japan will as well. So you've got another nuclear arms race potentially building. And so it's a really, I just wish we could go back and we didn't have the fire and fury in 2017, because honestly, that rhetoric allowed Kim Jong-un to justify the building of his nuclear weapons. What we should have done is really scaled down the rhetoric back in 2017 to avoid this situation. But we are where we are, so we just have to move forward. But it is a terrifying prospect for me as somebody who has a personal stake in what happens in the region. It's not just the region either. I mean, if North Korea, if we bring them into the nuclear club, they're going to have that for the rest of eternity, right? And so it's a difficult question. I wanted to mention that my colleague at the Wilson Center, Robert Litvak, looks at these issues. Go to the Wilson Center website, look at his profile, download his monograph. He looks at these issues very closely, and so he does present options that I think would be helpful for anyone who's interested in exploring whether this is an option for North Korea. He also looks at past examples that we mentioned earlier as well with other countries, including Iran and Libya.
And the rare case of South Africa giving up their nuclear arsenal, which is kind of interesting. So we're getting some great questions here. I'll do two at a time, and please keep the responses a little shorter. So here's one. I'll combine these two. What is the prospect of bilateral talks if there is continued wartime mentality? And the related question right next to it is, I'll quote here, "It does not help the cause of peace when think tanks are influenced by the armament industry." So what do you have to say about the prospect for peace given the headwinds against that?
Yeah, for your call to be shorter, I will just reiterate my comments that talks, the point of them is to advance ideas and come to more steps, next steps that are actually moving the needle. And so if the US is not prepared to do that, then I don't know why there should be more talks. And, you know, for political reasons, for domestic popularity, but within both countries, I could see the leaders maybe wanting to have another go at it. But in terms of getting away from that wartime mentality and actually having productive talks that get us closer to goals, let's end the war and let's start there, and let's actually have some concrete steps towards that. To Jan's question or quote here about the think tanks, I saw that story breaking this morning that that think tanks are receiving money from weapons manufacturers, and there's a connection there in South Korea. And so I haven't had a chance to read the story yet, so I don't want to comment on it, but it's a worthwhile point that there are moneyed interests that are that have a stake in staying in that wartime mentality and staying in a place of tensions and and militarism. So it's certainly worth sort of zooming out and thinking about all the factors and all the stakeholders who benefit depending on which way talks go.
Gene?
Well, the Wilson Center doesn't receive money from those organizations, so, but I think it's complicated, obviously. That's a complicated issue of receiving money from groups that have vested interest. I think that I'm so sorry, what's the earlier question? Remind me again.
It's the related question of basically what, you know, how can we have, you know,
a wartime mentality?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So, you know, the wartime mentality is something that North Korea has used very effectively to get the Americans to the table. And so we should recognize that as well. You know, I personally feel that Kim Jong-un wants to move past the wartime mentality. I mean, I think, you know, when you're on the ground in North Korea, you see it everywhere. And it's so surprising when you go there because we call it the forgotten war in the United States. And I don't even remember studying it as a student. And we've just forgotten that this even exists. But in North Korea, it's everywhere. It's a highly militarized society. The North Koreans have used it as a central component of their ideology and their foreign policy. And so they use it to great effect. So we need to remember that this is very much, again, a point of view or a mentality that the North Koreans are promoting from their side. Now, the Americans have their own vested interests as well. You know, if you go back in history, they had a bigger issue, which was China, and that continues today. North Korea and South Korea are, in a sense, pawns in this whole larger issue of US strategic competition, and that has been the case since the 1950s and earlier. And so we need to remember and put that into context. North Korea has been very effective in using that to make sure that their needs and their ambitions and their goals are recognized. But this is a larger regional issue, and so it's not just about North Korea and the United States, but I would say it's part of the broader US-China strategic interest. So that's the wartime mentality, I think, and the wartime need on both the sides of the North Koreans and the Americans.
So another question is there a world in which we create new multilateral arms control agreements with North Korea at the table as a signatory? Elizabeth?
Yes, thank you. That would be great. North Korea is a country, and they are fully capable of making international commitments. They're a UN member organization. They previously have been part of multilateral agreements to that end, and so that would be great. There's no reason not to engage in multilateral diplomacy and come to multi-way agreements and increase engagement, increase accountability, increase verification. I think that's what we're going for.
And this, by the way, connects to the next question, which is how to best achieve peace. So, Jean, do you want to add to that?
How to best achieve peace. I mean, I think that we have to be very realistic. So for me, I think that, the point is we need to understand the North Korean thinking. As I said earlier, I do think President Trump miscalculated and underestimated how important these nuclear weapons were to Kim Jong-un and his security and stability. The question of the vision of what a peaceful Korean Peninsula is really, it will vary from stakeholder to stakeholder. I think for the most part, from the South Koreans' perspective, most South Koreans, including my family members, would very much want to live in peaceful coexistence with the North Koreans, but they don't want unification, but they want to be able to exist with them. However, from the North Korean point of view, with the many North Koreans I've spoken to, they feel left behind by the South Koreans, and they will do everything they can to remind and pressure the South Koreans to take care of them. So it's a really complicated process. Peace for the Koreans will likely, in a practical sense, mean some sort of economic agreement where the two countries exist separately, but that there's a huge amount of money flowing from South Korea to North Korea in order to buy that sense of, in a sense, a kind of insurance against provocation, realistically speaking. And some sort of agreement between the United States and North Korea on the war and on what that means for the two Koreas. So it's complicated. I do think that we need to recognize what the Koreans want, but also recognize the larger geopolitical issues that are at stake for the superpowers in the region.
The final question is, Secretary of Defense Mark Esper recently called North Korea a rogue state, bringing that phrase back into currency. What do you see as the meaning of the revival of that term, and why is language and rhetoric important to this subject? It's a final question.
Yeah, great. So just a little bit more on that last point about how we get to peace. The only additional context I would give is that I do think we have to get away from thinking of peace as a thing we get to after there are no more problems to solve, and that everything's been resolved. Peace is a deliberate policy choice that is really hard work and comes with setbacks and comes with obstacles. It's a serious policy option that I think too often, especially, I talk to Congress a lot, and I think there is sort of a misconception sometimes that like being in a state of peace and choosing peace over a state of war is something that comes at the end of a process once everything else is resolved. And I think it sort of connects with this question because we're in a state of peace with all kinds of countries who we have a lot of problems with, and have really abysmal human rights records and authoritarian tendencies. And and are very chaotic actors. And so it's very interesting to see this term revive, because language does matter, and it does send a signal about how we see a country and how we see them as potential folks to sit across the table with in negotiations. So I don't think that's particularly helpful. I don't know if it signals that the US is just doubling down on this maximum pressure approach and is not very interested in coming to the table with new ideas. But I think it is worth, zooming back and saying, when do we talk about a country like a regime? When do we talk about it like a nation state? When we say the rogue state, when do we call them an ally, a partner? I think it's rather inconsistently applied, and there is that history and that context to go into it. And so resetting that and getting away from this mentality that it's zero sum, and that coming to the table with new ideas and changing course, trying peace, really putting it on the table is a gift or is a concession. It's really counterproductive, and I see this kind of language just doubling down on that mindset.
I think the North Koreans I would say that the North Koreans love the fact that the defense secretary called North Korea a rogue state. It helps Kim Jong-un justify any kind of military buildup. He can use that and tell his people and his military, see, we still need to keep up our defenses. But if it came from President Trump, that would be a completely different issue. If it came from President Trump, that would make the North Koreans nervous. And so we're seeing a little bit of a good cop, bad cop situation here. I think it doesn't, I don't think it threatens US-North Korean relations at all. I think that the North Koreans are looking for this type of language to justify the testing that they're continuing to do.
Well, thank you, everyone. Elizabeth and Jean, this has been incredibly timely and educational and enjoyable as well. This is really nice to chat with you. And we already got some good feedback on the chat. So I think you did really well. And we're ending like a minute early. So
can I just say one more thing? I just wanted to mention, I'm just going to toot the Wilson Center horn, which is that I found it really significant that we're marking the 70th anniversary of the Korean War. We don't normally mark the start of a conflict, but we haven't had an end. So I thought we should really focus on revisiting the history and thinking about what this war means for us, both in terms of history, the present, and the future. And so please take a look at the Wilson Quarterly issue. It's www.wilsonquarterly.com, because we did commission pieces that I think will help bring several different layers of analysis and nuance to how to look at the Korean War. I had this opportunity with one of my young scholars. She went into the National Archives and found letters from North Korean soldiers. I just think that we've just tried to bring a very different perspective and essentially try to humanize the issue of the war. We have our South Korean scholar, Sujin Park, talk about reunification. So if you want to look at some polling and points of view about how South Koreans think about reunification, please take a look at her piece. And then I brought the commander from the UN inside the DMZ. He was the commander of the security battalion inside the DMZ, who's had many, many interactions with the North Koreans and was there to host President Trump for his handshake a year ago. Have him write a very thoughtful essay about what it's like to interact with the North Koreans. So just wanted to plug that, because I think it might be of interest to some of the people on the call today.
Thanks again.
Sorry for giving plugs. Can I just say that there's a forthcoming report called Path to Peace from the Korea Peace Now campaign, which Women Cross DMZ is part of. It includes chapters on what is a peace agreement, who needs to sign it, what should it contain, what would the process be like, and then what would that mean for things like human rights, the nuclear question, inter-Korean relations, deals with all these things we're talking about, and it's forthcoming later this year.
Thank you. And I think all three of us are on Twitter, so people can continue to engage with us, indefinitely, as long as Twitter is around. Thanks again, everyone, and have a nice day.
Thank you.